Welcome to the CFO Show. I'm your host, Melissa Howitson, CFO of Vena Solutions.
And I'm Tom Sigmiller, VP of FP&A at Vena.
Finance sits at a really interesting intersection within a business. Not only do we have to optimize how we run our own function, but we also have to help the business optimize both operational performance and where to make investments. This often requires us to sit at the seat and help determine where to make those strategic investments and what trade-offs need to be made. It can sometimes be a challenging thing to do to figure out what to stop and what to start doing. We're going to have a very interesting discussion today, digging deeper into this topic.
Melissa, to get started, what are the big topics or areas of investment that you're typically seeing as strategic at this point?
There's a number of them, and it will depend on the business, but I think that there's a couple areas that are very common for many businesses. First one is always going to be headcount. When you think about headcount as often one of the largest spends that a business has, figuring out which investments you need to make in which parts of the talent and team, that's a critical one. I think along with that, I think what's really emerging is skills and skill development. What skill sets do you need for today and tomorrow? Do you have those skill sets in-house? Do you need to think about going outside to bring them in? Or can you help with upskilling and reskilling internally to get those skills of the future? So I'd say that's the first one. I think a second one that's really important strategically is technology. Given how quickly technology is changing, I think companies are looking across their portfolio of technology in relation to their processes and figuring out where do they need to make the most important technology investments. There's no shortage of things you could be investing in, but you really have to spend some time figuring out what are going to be those ones that are going to move the needle the most for the business. I think depending on the business as well, ESG is another strategic area of investment as businesses figure out what that means for them and where they need to go. Supply chain remains strategic for depending on the nature of your business and making sure that you're watching what changes are happening there and investing accordingly. So that's a short list. There's many more, but I think those are top of mind.
And is it just an outright investment in any of these areas that you think qualifies as strategic, or do you have to think about things differently ultimately within the org for it to be deemed to be strategic? And what I mean by that is, if you just add another headcount as you have in the past, is that strategic or is that just maintaining status quo?
I think it depends. I think when I think of strategic, I usually start with what are you trying to accomplish as the business? What are those things you're going to do to help you move there? And where do you really need to be doubled down on making sure that these things are top priority and they need to be done? And so often strategic investments become those things that you're going to do differently to help you move from where you are now to where you're going. There's certain things that are really important in a business, but more status quo or ordinary operations of just helping you to function. But usually I think, leadership teams, when they look at what's our strategic roadmap that we're on in line with our vision of where we're going, and what are the key things we need to be doing to be moving the dial now? So when I think about those headcount, for instance, in that context, some additions of staff will be just keeping things going and getting the things done that you need to do. But there will be other areas if a business has decided that they want to lean into a certain area. Let's say it's artificial intelligence. That's a strategic imperative. Well, then that's different thinking and you have to figure out how you're going to resource for that.
So very intentional and pointed then in those instances.
Yes. And I think it's really important that as a business is getting aligned, that you're clear what is strategic and what isn't, because you could start to use that word. It is actually often an overused word to mean lots of things. I usually think it's a smaller list of the most important things that you're going to be doing that might be moving the business forward or making changes. And how are you all aligning to make sure that the investments you're going to make are actually going to come together? Because if one group's pursuing something that they see as strategic and another group does not see it as strategic, you're not going to be aligning where your investments are. Strategy, you often hear, strategy is as much about choosing what you are not going to do as it is deciding what you are going to do. Because it's so tempting to try and do all of it.
And I assume you need to get consensus around the executive table in doing that then.
100% critical. So Tom, question back for you. How do you think companies figure out what investments to make that are truly investments, not just expenses?
I think you have to suspend your thinking around status quo and stop thinking, what has my run rate been historically? And start to think very, very actively around, if I were to deploy a zero based budgeting approach, so we are starting the organization from scratch today, where would you go and why? And I think the minute you take that tether or those chains off from the past and thinking we've done it this way and we just have to continue down this path, is the minute you can spare up dollars for investment, is the minute you start to focus on those things that really count, and is the minute you get out of that box that you're ultimately constrained by, typically within an organization.
And how important do you think that ROI or payback or business cases are as part of that?
Oh, I think it's essential. I love the saying, don't throw good money after bad. And I think so many organizations do things over and over and over again because they've done it in the past. And if you were to start from scratch, ultimately, you'd make all sorts of different decisions that could drive extraordinary ROI compared to what you're generating at status quo.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes you almost have to stop that momentum of doing what you've always done by creating a hard pause on rethinking and forcing yourself to think different, because it's easier said than done.
It's a pretty painful thing to do, in fact, when you think about it. You're challenging everything that everybody does every day. And there's often a visceral and emotional reaction to doing that. And so making sure you navigate those conversations with empathy and in the right fashion is so, so, so important. You can say the right things in life, but if it's not delivered properly, it'll land in so few instances.
Yeah, influence is such a key skill in that.
Are there any types of spend that you think typically get a bad rap within an organization that it's maybe unfair and that are worth discussing?
I think there are some that often are misunderstood for sure. I think about areas, sometimes I've seen marketing actually be that, where people don't necessarily know where it's going or what it's doing because the return or payback isn't as obvious and readily apparent. And yet, you know that it's having if you really dig deep, it is having an impact on the business. And I think it's really important to look at it as more strategic than I think sometimes is looked at by folks, depending on where you've come from. It's seen as, well, we don't need that event, or we don't need to spend money on swag, and it's so much more than just those individual things. It's how it all comes together to actually drive forward your go-to-market engine and driving results there. I think, some other tactical ones, travel. I think that, we as finance people have often looked at it as, oh gosh, we could cut the travel budget. We should cut those. And I think there's sometimes waste in there that you want to be aware of, but there is good travel. And I think sometimes we lose our way and forget that having people go on site when it's appropriate, because that's going to be the better way, whether it's how you're implementing or making connections with prospects or potential customers, because you're actually going to get a better outcome by having spent the money to travel, to go and have those conversations. I think probably in the current climate, especially post-COVID, workspace costs are sometimes misunderstood, or people are trying to reframe what those are. I don't think they're just cost. Obviously, many of us in finance found that we were paying for space we were not using, and there was dead money in all of that. But you also have to figure out, what is it you're trying to achieve with that space? What is the outcome? And are you designing for that? And so there's a lot of transitioning happening in terms of creating those spaces for connection, collaboration, networking, things that actually do drive real business outcomes, but tying it to what otherwise is, just a spend without the outcomes attached. Gosh, you've got me going here. I think technology sometimes is seen as, well, so many systems, why this? And I think you really do need to stay true to, again, what is it actually saving you elsewhere in the organization? Are you double down on the most important technology? And then are you, really making sure that you're properly invested in that? I think too, consultants would be another line item that sometimes gets a bad rap but at the same time, there's a time and a place if you don't have the experience, and a quicker path would be leveraging somebody who's seen this before and done it there can be good spend on consultants too.
It's probably really important how we show up in these conversations too. So if I think about largely misunderstood items within an organization, we sit in a unique place in which we can help to quantify and shape the understanding of these sorts of investments in the org. Any other ways you think finance can help shape those conversations?
Well, I think, you just touched on that because we sometimes forget that we sit at this unique intersection and we see things that others don't see, and it can be taken for granted. And so we can start to understand if there's the impact happening. Hey, had an event, we saw engagement come up, we saw creation of pipeline or strengthened our relationships with customers. Again, not always easy to measure all of those things, but you can start to see some of the trends or correlations across the business and us helping people understand the why. I always say I'm big on, if people know your why you're doing something, then often it's because you see something, they're questioning it because you see something that they don't see, and you need to take that time and communicate, and also be willing to be challenged because maybe what we see, but they see something else that we're missing, to help us figure out if these really are driving the results or impacts that we need, and what are those areas that maybe we don't need to be as invested in and could be shifting those dollars over to other strategic areas.
I love it. Share our insights and don't be shy about it.
Absolutely. It's all good and well for us in finance to be thinking strategically and maybe alongside the CEO and a few other execs. But what we really need is for our whole business to start aligning on those things that are most strategic for the organization. So any thoughts on that and how we can play a role in that, getting that alignment on strategies?
It's essential to the long-term success of the organization. The conversation needs to quickly move from this is a finance conversation or a finance chat to this is an important business discussion to be having. And the minute you can get your entire executive team and your senior leadership folks thinking about how do we make great business decisions versus finance is forcing this conversation over here because we want to see these efficiencies or this desired outcome, the sooner you start to get buy-in within the organization, the sooner you actually start to drive the outcomes, and the greater the chance of success ultimately. And so to get there, it's really around partnership with the organization. How do you share and in some instances even educate folks as to the perspective maybe that we're taking from a financial perspective? So taking the time, be patient, seek to have a joint understanding of a situation, and work your way towards consensus, knowing that it doesn't necessarily happen in a day, a week, a month. It's going to be an evolution that's going to take time at that table. But to the extent that you can get everybody on the same page, you're way more likely to drive the outcomes you're looking for.
Absolutely agree. And I think also we can identify where there is a lack of consensus and where investments are now not being placed wisely because you think you have that alignment and consensus, but maybe you don't. And I think similarly, us calling that out, and maybe it's because what we thought we were going to do, some are seeing that it doesn't make sense, and so we've lost their buy-in. Calling out those moments where the misalignment is creeping in and getting everyone back to figure out, are we still aligned? This is where we need to go. Is it something actually we're going to change course, which is okay. But the worst thing I think we can do is sit and watch this misalignment happen and not actually speak up and point out that it's happening, because that's investments that are not being made wisely then.
Those gaps in understanding, they're a killer. There's no other way to put it.
Absolutely. I think along with that too, I mentioned influence skills. That ability, we talked about partnership, also influencing and helping people to see what you're seeing from other parts of the organization and influencing to make sure you've got that alignment.
Is there a mindset or perspective that you ultimately need to take when you're kicking off these conversations so that you drive to those ideal outcomes within the organization?
I think one would be open-minded. I think it's really easy to have an immediate reaction to an idea. And I think sometimes in finance, if we jump to a conclusion too quickly, we don't actually hear what the idea was or where someone was going. And so taking that time to listen, not passing judgment right away, but actually, which also allows us to then be at the table because people will feel it's a safe place to explore the idea, but then help frame it and help get to the conclusion of, does this make sense or doesn't it make sense? So, eventually you do have to make a call, and maybe it is a good idea, maybe it's not, but just making sure there's the time and space to think about that. I think also being willing to make tough calls. So when you get in there, and it almost sounds at odds with what I just said, because you need to listen, be open-minded, but at the same time, at certain points where it's obvious that things maybe are not as high priority or being invested poorly, make the tough calls to say, hey, we got to stop here. We got to revisit this and not just assume that status quo is the way to go. And in order to do that, I think it requires sometimes a bit of radical thinking where you have to stop some of the inertia that is happening. And it's just got momentum towards wanting to keep doing things the same way, where you've got to create something that puts those brakes on and actually forces a pause and a rethink just to make sure that it makes sense to keep on putting money into those things. How about you? Any thoughts about other ideas that would help there?
I like the concept of a hard reset. We have this really cool and challenging role to play within the organization, in that we're often the ones to bring forward these tough conversations. And I find it a very rewarding thing. It's not always easy. It's not always popular. But on the other side of it, I find it drives towards such productive and meaningful conversations that it's worth doing it every single time. And so I think one of the mindsets is being willing to be that unpopular person that gets that conversation going, that maybe the organization doesn't want, but it's ultimately what it needs.
Yeah, and that can be tough sometimes, playing the bad cop, right? When in those conversations, and you're reminding me of, that importance of being able to think everything is on the table, nothing is sacred, and creating a safe place for that mindset to actually be there. And I think maybe one more that I would add is failing fast. I think it's okay to take chances and make investments, but pulling the plug when you know that there's signs that this isn't going to work. I think a lot of times we all let things run too long when we knew, and we start wasting money when we could have pivoted those precious resources to something else.
Totally agreed. It's like seeing your favorite athlete go to the bitter end when they should have called it a few years earlier at their prime.
Absolutely. Any thoughts you've got, tips and tricks on how to actually make these tough trade-offs within the organization?
I think what we just talked about is actually a perfect lead into this. And if you're sitting with your executive team and having those tough conversations, you stop throwing good money after bad. I think it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're never going to be in this place where you're saying, I can't fund the strategic initiatives. And you kicked off really, really well earlier and at the beginning when you said it's as much about deciding what you're not going to do versus what you are going to do. And if you make those lists and those have a joint understanding around those things that you're not going to do, all of a sudden you're going to be able to scratch off a whole bunch of areas of, and I'm going to call it spend, not investment, that perhaps existed historically within the organization. And through scratching off those spend areas, you should have more than sufficient dollars to invest in this particular instance in the strategic areas.
Couldn't agree more. And that's often the friction that you get, right? When you're thinking about how do I invest? It's often approached as I need more dollars then to do those strategic things. But the reality is you don't always have more dollars. You just have to deploy differently. And so figuring out those things you're not going to do so that you can fund the things you need to do, really, really critical. I also think it's about getting that buy-in from others on the trade-offs. And so when somebody's coming looking for more money, also understanding, okay, so that's the problem. You need more, but what's the solution in terms of where do you think we might actually get that money from? Because you're right. Often it's finance. I need more. And we're looking around going, but everybody needs what they have. We may have ideas on where to go look for that money, But I often find when you actually engage the business in the conversation with you, and now you frame it as, well, what's the trade-off you think we should make, especially when folks are sometimes closer to that area of the business, it changes the game and actually helps make sure that you are moving things to those priority, because the trade-offs can't just be a finance thing that we're making. We have to be helping broker the trade-offs, having input, working, especially when it's a trade-off between one team and another. Let's say, hey, we think we need to spend less in sales because we need to fund more in marketing. Well, you need that whole go-to-market engine on board with these are the right places, regardless of my functional area of the business that I'm responsible for.
So ultimately holding the business accountable for seeing it through to completion.
Absolutely. And I think measuring it too, having a good way of measuring those outcomes, especially for some of the bigger, more strategic things. You won't always get it right. Sometimes it'll actually have been a failure, and that's okay. But you've measured, you've learned, you've adjusted for next time so that you get better and better at making those right trade-offs.
I really like the concept of needing trade-offs. Do you have any good examples that you can share, Melissa?
I'll give you an example of a trade-off that I've faced that we had to make, which can be tough decisions. I was once part of a business where we were entirely on-premise, and we knew we needed to make the transition to being on cloud in order to be able to scale and actually survive in the future. But that was going to take money, lots of resources, lots of energy. And it meant that we were going to have to double down on creating space to invest in still running on-premise while also building for on-cloud, which is a doubling up of your investments for a period of time, because you're not at that point being efficient in either one. And we had to find other parts in the business that we were not going to invest as much in order to fund that. In that case, we were putting more money into R&D to fund that development, and we were putting less money into sales and marketing to make it happen. Tough call, but needed to be done.
So Melissa, we're going to try something different today. Normally, we ask our guests 2 rapid fire questions at the end of every conversation. Today, I'm going to pose them to you. And so the first question is, what's the best piece of leadership advice you've ever received?
Yeah, I like this question. So I would say early on in my career, I had a leader who said, choose your words carefully. If in doubt, especially when you're going to be speaking in front of employees or a big group of people, make sure that you've thoughtfully picked your answers and that you're communicating your message in a way that cannot be misunderstood or misinterpreted later, because it's such an easy way to erode trust if later on what you said is different than what you did. And it really can break down, and it takes a long time to rebuild that.
And the second question, what is the most impactful book you've ever read?
Oh, I've got a few, but I'd say there's one that always sticks out for me, which is The Beauty of Discomfort, which is by Amanda Lang. And what I liked about that book is she talked about how we actually need to force ourselves into discomfort to learn, to grow, to think differently. And that sometimes it's just so easy for us to want to choose removing the friction, removing those things that are uncomfortable. And yet that's actually how we build resilience and how we foster some of those skills that you need to move forward. So that one's always stuck with me.
Fantastic.
Tom, really enjoyed having this conversation with you today. You can tell we're both very passionate about this topic. So thanks for joining me. And if you'd like to learn more about today's episode, please visit the links in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts, because you don't want to miss an episode. And if you liked what you heard today, please leave us a review on any of the streaming platforms. We would love to hear from you, and it helps other listeners to find the show. For the CFO Show, I'm your host, Melissa Howitson. Until next time.